Hi, thanks everyone for joining us today. This is Rachel Riley-Carroll with Enterprise. I lead a portfolio of our impact investing work here at Enterprise, and that includes the Impact Note program, some of our public policy efforts, which now, as of late December, includes the Opportunity Zones program. So I really appreciate everyone joining us. I think that this is a really important moment to be talking about this program. We have a lot of interest in the program. As Donna mentioned, we will not be doing Q&A in this really quick 30-minute webinar, mostly because there has been so much interest. Over 1,200 people have registered for the webinar, and so just for the sake of efficiency, we figured it would be best to take that offline, but really do encourage folks to submit questions in the box so we can understand what you guys are thinking and understand where there are information gaps that we can be acting and continuing to serve as a resource moving forward. So really quickly, I want to go over the agenda and what we have planned for you guys. I'm going to do a really quick program overview of Opportunity Zones program, and with me today we have Olivia Barrow from our public policy team, as well as Zach Patton from our knowledge team and our Opportunity 360 efforts. And Olivia is going to talk about, what our path is towards implementation, as well as some upcoming deadlines that I want everyone to be aware of. And Zach has been doing really wonderful work in helping us understand what's really at play for these census tracts. What does an opportunity zone look like? And building out some resources that those advocates and folks in the governor's offices can be utilizing to make really smart strategic decisions around how we're thinking about what communities should be eligible to be opportunity zones and which communities can make optimal use of capital that flows through this program. And with that, I'm going to get started. So the background of Opportunity Zones program, some of you guys may have heard it referenced as the Investing in Opportunity Act. That's what it had been called for a number of years. It was originally introduced in the 114th, towards the tail end of that. Again, it was introduced in February of 2017, so the 115th Congress. And this is really the product of an effort through the Economic Innovation Group, which is a bipartisan public policy think tank organization research firm here in DC. And they've really been leading the effort on this, getting the word out, and so they're a great resource if you want more information about the Opportunity Zones program. And I failed to mention that at the back end of this presentation, we have a full page of a bunch of links to websites and resources that we've been utilizing that I think will be helpful for you as well. Economic Innovation Group obviously is one of them. They put out guidance for governors most recently, as well as a full explanation of tax incentives for investors, just to name two. So moving forward, in late December, this Investing in Opportunity Act, the critical piece of that legislation, which is now the Opportunity Zones program, was enacted as part of tax reform. And what it's really meant to do is it's designed to be a vehicle to promote economic recovery and create long-term capital that can be useful in communities that are maybe lagging behind in that economic recovery. And this is really meant for both rural and low-income urban communities. And the mechanism that it uses is it uses tax incentives to encourage this private investment into impact funds, which are now authorized as opportunity funds. And those opportunity funds really connect investors with new community investing opportunities. And before I go on, I want to level set around what this is and what it isn't. So for community development practitioners, we're very used to thinking about the New Market Tax Credit Program or the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. And this is not a program at all. This is a tax benefit. And so we're not going to be seeing the tight regulations around this as we would for the New Market Tax Credit Program or Low-Income Housing Program. just because this is something that will likely be administered through IRS as it is a corporate and individual tax benefit. And there's no annual appropriations or authorizations associated with it. And once the governors are finished making their recommendations around opportunity zones, that's kind of where the market takes over. It's meant to be very market responsive, market driven. There's no mandates around it after that. So that's really the context and framework that I want folks to be, that may be helpful in thinking about how this tax benefit, how this new vehicle and resource can be used in communities. And like I mentioned, the real mechanism for driving this new source of capital into the communities are these opportunity funds. And opportunity funds, capital O, capital F, so it's a legitimate term, they are authorized through tax reform, and their purpose is basically to be an intermediary to aggregate and deploy capital that support another term, which is opportunity zone property, or basically the eligible assets that can be invested into opportunity zones, or the census tracts and communities in which are eligible to receive these investments. Opportunity funds are going to be certified by Treasury. We still don't have guidance around what that certification process will look like. We'll go into that a little bit later. But how we're imagining it is that because this is meant to be a market-responsive program, that it's going to be optimized for flexibility. So there's not going to be a lot of mandates and rules around what an opportunity fund looks like other than what's in the legislation and some additional factors that may be included during the rules-making process. And the real innovation around this is that the opportunity funds look to the $2.2 trillion in unrealized capital gains as a new resource for community investment capital. And so there's an estimated $2.2 trillion in unrealized capital gains currently sitting on the books of individuals and corporations right now through, what's been realized on stocks and mutual funds. And what typically would happen is that once you sell those assets, the proceeds from those sales would be taxed at around 24% or at capital gains plus an additionality. And this incentive around this is saying instead of getting taxed at that rate, if you invest through opportunity funds into distressed communities, you will receive certain tax benefits for doing so. So we run through that a little bit here. It's meant to. Some of the other things that are interesting about it is that the structure of the fund allows for pooling of capital. So hopefully it can help scale community investment. And the fund managers, they can be really any entity. So it can be community development financial institutions or other intermediaries, which we typically think about as community investment vehicles or managers. It could be asset managers, other banks, fiduciaries, et cetera. And one of the things that's not clear, but we think, is it could potentially be government and quasi-government entities. The opportunity zones, we're going to go into more depth on this later as well, so I'm just going to gloss over it very quickly. But what I do want to say is that once these opportunity zones are identified, these are 10-year designations. And so if you think about that, we want to be very, very strategic in how we're identifying these opportunity zones, and that's a role that enterprise is wanting to play in providing the resources and tools necessary to help advocates and the states think about what that might look like. And EIG, Economic Innovation Group, has also provided guidance to governors, and some of the things that they've said is that governors should be immediately establishing a process for nominating these opportunity zones, and that part of that process should be actively soliciting input from the mayors, from county commissioners, and other local stakeholders. and that governor should also be designating a point person or agency to lead that effort, both on zone designation as well as investor outreach and just any sort of additional support and Q&A that's coming from the public, because there are a lot of questions that aren't getting a lot of answers right now just because there isn't that resource available to be fielding those questions. So, so that's what EIG is saying, and the other reason, well, what I want to say to that is that we're looking at this 90-day window, so 90 days since enactment, which gives us to March 21st for these designations to be made, and there could be an extension around that, but I do want to point everyone to Missouri, who has issued an RFP, which is the one state that I've seen. If anyone else has seen other states that have done this, I'd be interested in taking a look at that. But then there's also no guidance on what happens if governors do not submit recommendations. So in previous iterations of the legislation, there had been a provision that said if governors do not submit recommendations for opportunity zones, that Treasury would basically backstop that and identify those opportunity zones as the agency, so they would do it themselves. That was stripped from the enacted legislation, and so right now we have no guidance on that. But the problem is that governors still think it's still in there, or the message hasn't been funneled down, so I just want to say that we are not seeing that in the legislation, and so we need some guidance from Treasury on that. And then the types of investments I want to quickly mention are referred to as opportunity zone property, and basically you're thinking of it as equity investments into businesses and real estate. And for the real estate piece of it, it's substantial improvement of property, and that has a 30-month window to it. There's more information in the legislation. I'm sure there will be more details put around that during the rules and regs process. And really, this is meant to encourage, again, flexibility. So funds can be created to make one investment in one opportunity zone for one asset, or they could be national opportunity funds that make investments in every single opportunity zone across all asset types. And so there really is, it runs the gamut there. And the type of capital, like, I think is really important to understand what this capital will and will not do. This is private equity capital that is going to be responsive to market demand. Market is going to determine the preferred return around it. It's going to determine the risk tolerance as well as where capital is invested. Just because we're identifying opportunity zones doesn't mean that there's a mandate to invest in that opportunity zone. And just because there's 3 asset types doesn't mean that the market is going to be responsive to all 3 of those asset types. And so what we really think is very important is that, especially as it pertains to opportunity zones, is that the way that we're thinking about capital is that the zones can absorb this type of capital, and that there are other aligned resources that can help facilitate that. And then very quickly, I just want to share with you guys the tax incentives for investors. Again, EIG did a really great write-up on the tax benefits for investing in opportunity zones. It's linked right there. Basically, there's 3 real breaks or tiered benefits associated with this. And this is really around rolling your unrealized capital gains into opportunity funds. The first is temporary tax deferral, and you have to recognize your tax either at exit or at the latest at the end of 2026. And then you have a step up in basis provision. So for a minimum of 5 years invested, your basis is increased by 10%, which basically means you're only paying taxes on 90% of what you've invested, and then your 7-year is similar, 15% increase step up in basis, which is 85%. And then if you invest in 10-year hold, so an investment for 10 years, any gain that is accrued on your investment in the Opportunity Fund is considered permanently excluded from taxable income. So it's not your original investment that you made in the fund, it's any interest you earned or any gain from that investment. And so it's sort of like a sweetener on top to help promote long-term investment. So that's at that 10-year mark. And before I turn it over to Olivia to talk about implementation, what I do think is really important to say regarding implementation is that in order to fully take advantage of this 7-year step-up in basis provision, we're looking at these funds needing to be created and invested in by late 2019. Because if you're looking at that 2026 date where your tax is going to have to be recognized, then funds need to be stood up by late 2019 in order to max out that, that benefit. And so while we think that that is where we're headed as far as getting the funds stood up, there's no guarantee that that's going to happen, but just wanting to put the math on that. And with that, Olivia, I'll turn it over.
Thanks, Rachel. So while this new program certainly does present a lot of potential for community development efforts, there is still a ways to go before the investments can begin. So the tax reform bill authorized the creation of the Opportunity Zones program, but left the actual structure and implementation of the program to the Treasury Department. So Treasury must now go through the formal rulemaking process in order to finalize a version of the program that meets the requirements laid out in the statute, while also potentially incorporating additional qualifications or requirements for the program. Part of this rulemaking process includes an opportunity to submit public comments, which will be a critical opportunity for stakeholders to weigh in with recommendations for how to most efficiently structure and manage this new program. However, Treasury has not yet provided information about its intended timeline for proposing a rule or even for considering comments, meaning that there is limited guidance for implementation process of this new program. But we do know some things, and that includes the two aspects of the program that will need to be structured, the first being designating census tracts as qualified opportunity zones, and the second being certification and oversight of the investment funds. So I'll start with the process for designating census tracts as opportunity zones, since, as Rachel said, there is some urgency around the timeline for submitting these nominations. So as Rachel mentioned, governors do have the ability to nominate 25% of the state's low-income census tracts to be eligible for investments through the Opportunity Funds. And the 90-day period that governors have to nominate census tracts did begin when the tax reform bill was signed into law at the end of December. So this puts the deadline for census tract nominations at March 21st. Although I will note that governors can request a 30-day extension for nominating census tracts. And after governors submit these nominations, Treasury then has 30 days to approve or deny these nominations, and Treasury also has the option for a 30-day extension. So designating the opportunity zones really is a critical step in this program because the census tracts will retain this opportunity zones classification for the next 10 years, which, as Rachel mentioned, is really going to have significant impacts on the local community. We have been hearing some sort of confusion from our partners and local stakeholders about nominating census tracts prior to the final rule being implemented because local groups are concerned that they don't have all of the information to identify census tracts without knowing exactly how investments will be made in these communities. So several of these local stakeholders are urging their governors to request the 30-day extension to hopefully provide slightly more time to gather information about how the program will be structured before having to make these very significant decisions. I will also note that Shay Hawkins, who works on tax policy in Senator Tim Scott's office, was on a recent National Development Council webinar where he did indicate that Senator Scott's office has been working with the Treasury Department to see if it is possible to extend the Census Tract nomination timeline so that it would apply after the final law is implemented rather than starting when the tax bill was signed. But because of the way the statute was written, it's not necessarily clear that Treasury will have the authority to extend the nomination period. So for now, it is safest to proceed under the assumption that nominations are due on March 21st. The final aspect of implementation relates to certifying the opportunity funds, which we do anticipate will fall to the IRS since the program does have a tax benefit to it. So the statute itself really is quite bare bones and only provides two requirements for certifying the funds. The first being that the fund must be a corporation or partnership, and the second being that the fund must invest at least 90% of its assets into opportunity zones. We have been hearing that the certification process may be structured similarly to the process for certifying community development entities, which of course is a helpful starting point for thinking about how these funds might be organized, and does suggest that the CDFI fund may play a role in overseeing the Opportunity Zones program. But overall, the information available is quite limited and has naturally resulted in a lot of questions over the past month about what types of investments will be eligible and how the funds will be structured. And unfortunately, our answer has often been that we won't know until a proposed rule is available, since any of these additional qualifications or requirements for the program will have to be decided during the rulemaking process. But just in closing on the implementation side of things, I'll say that it's not every day that a new federal community investment tool is created and implemented, so the coming months as the process unfolds really will be important for local stakeholders to stay involved, because the rulemaking process is definitely the opportune time to raise concerns and ask questions and make those recommendations so that we can ensure that the end product is structured as efficiently as possible. So I will now turn it over to Zach so we can have a demo of Enterprise's new mapping tool.
Thanks, Olivia. Hello, everyone. My name is Zach Patton, and I am the Research Director for the Knowledge, Impact, and Strategy team at Enterprise. I also lead much of the Opportunity 360 work, which, if you haven't yet encountered, is an approach to understanding and improving outcomes using cross-sector data engagement and interactive tools like the one I'll be showing you today. We just launched our website a few months ago and have some of our initial tools and case studies up there for you to explore and use. So we'll have a link that we'll send around to that, and I encourage you to check it out. So I would really like to do two things in our time today. First, I'd like to spend a few minutes talking through what we know and what we don't know about the eligibility criteria for designation of opportunity zones, which is obviously critical to understand during this short time window for designation. And I should say that I've also put together a blog post that discusses this topic and goes into a bit more detail than what we'll have time to cover today. This will be posted in the next day or two, so be on the lookout for that on the Enterprise blog. And I should also give a disclaimer that this is all kind of our recommendations in the absence of official guidance from Treasury. So, anything is subject to change if they decide to kind of steer guidance in a different direction. The second thing I'm going to do today is give you a quick demonstration of a tool that we will be publishing to replace the initial map that we put together a few weeks back that some of you have seen. So I'm pretty excited to share that with you today. So with that said, let's talk about opportunity zone eligibility. So the opportunity zones that states are being asked to designate are composed of census tracts, which is a geography the Census Bureau created that's supposed to be a kind of neighborhood equivalent unit, if you haven't encountered that before. So that's what we're really talking about with respect to the units that are eligible for designation. And there's really two ways that census tracts can be eligible. The first way is by meeting the criteria for what is called a low-income community. And conveniently, that definition that's being used for the Opportunity Zones program is identical to the one that is used in the New Markets Tax Credit program. So if you're familiar with the definition there, it'll be the same here. So we already have a good understanding of what these criteria look like in practice. Tracts qualify if they have a poverty rate of at least 20% or if they have a median family income that is at or below a certain threshold, which is generally 80%. What that threshold ends up being a little more complicated. There are kind of two questions that we have to answer about the tract to determine which threshold we should be using. One is whether the tract is located in a metropolitan area or not, which determines whether we should use a statewide median family income or the greater of the statewide and metropolitan median family income for comparison. And then the second question is whether the tract is in a high migration rural county, which bumps the threshold up to 85% of the statewide median family income instead of 80%. And I explain all this in more detail in the blog post, so I'll refer you to that for additional information about how these things interact more specifically. The second way that tract can be eligible is by being what is called a tract contiguous to a low-income community. And to be eligible in this way, it has to meet both of two criteria. The first is that it's contiguous with a low-income community, meaning that it shares a border with the tract. And that tract also actually has to be designated as an opportunity zone, so you can't just have a contiguous tract kind of floating off by itself. It's not enough for it to just be a low-income community. And second, it has to have a median family income that does not exceed 125% of the median family income of at least one of the low-income communities it is contiguous with. And there were some questions that have come up about does it have to exceed 125% of all of the low-income communities it's contiguous with? Our understanding is that if it passes the test for at least one contiguous low-income community, then it meets the criteria. So with that said, let's talk about what this means in practice. So there are two key numbers that we need to be concerned about with respect to designations. The first is that each state and territory can designate up to 25% of the low-income communities as opportunity zones. And my understanding is that that 25% should always be rounded down. So knowing the low-income communities in a state not only tells us which tracts can be designated, but also establishes the maximum number of tracts that can be designated for that state or territory. And then the second number to consider is the 5% exemption for the eligible contiguous tracts. And this is not in addition to the 25%, this is a subset of that 25%. So an example of how this looks like, of what this looks like in practice, if a state has 400 tracts that are low-income communities, that state could designate 25% of those, or up to 100 tracts as opportunity zones. And then of those 100 tracts, 5% or 5 tracts, in this case, could be designated on the basis of being contiguous with low-income communities rather than low-income communities themselves. So I thought it would be helpful to share a few high-level stats about what this looks like nationwide and give us a sense of the potential reach of this program. So of the approximately 74,000 census tracts nationwide, nearly 32,000 qualify as low-income communities. And then there are an additional 9,700 or so tracts that are eligible contiguous tracts. So that means that over half of the tracts nationwide are potentially in play for this program. Once we apply the 25% cap per state, and there's also a special minimum provision of 25 tracts for states and territories with less than 100 low-income communities, we could see nearly 8,100 tracts, or about 11% of all census tracts nationwide that are designated as opportunity zones. So it's a pretty significant number of geographies that we're talking about as being not only eligible, but actually designated for this program. And lastly, before we jump into the demo, I wanted to give a few quick technical notes that I have encountered in questions that people have asked. So again, disclaimer that this is all based on our understanding prior to guidance from Treasury, so this is our best understanding of the way this is going to work. The first is that we recommend at present using 2011 to 2015 ACS data, which is already available from the CDFI Fund's New Market Tax Credit eligibility data. I wouldn't use the most recent data unless we hear otherwise from Treasury, because we are confident that Treasury will accept the 2011 to 2015 data, but we don't really know whether they would accept the more recent data, the 2012 to 2016 data. So to be on the safe side of this, it's probably better to use the 2011 to 2015 data, which is what we use in the tool that I'm about to show you. A second note is that we found that it's possible in some cases for tracts to be contiguous across state lines. So a tract in one state qualifies as contiguous on the basis of a low-income community in another state. The law really doesn't say anything specific about the tracts having to be contiguous with low-income communities in the same state, but because it does have to be contiguous with an actual opportunity zone designated tract for this scenario to happen, it would mean that states would need to coordinate to make this happen, and I could see that being potentially desirable in metropolitan areas that cross state borders, for example. But of course, Treasury may give different guidance on that, but that's our understanding at the moment. And one last note here, our current understanding is that only tracts that actually share a border count as contiguous. This is also known as a Rooks case versus a Queens case, which I have a picture of here on the next slide. So it's not enough for tracts to just touch at a single point. As you see in the white boxes there on the right, they actually need to have at least a small stretch of shared border. Probably this is irrelevant for most of you, but for those GIS folks on the call who have been tasked with actually figuring all this stuff out, this one is for you. So with that said, let me jump into our demo. Okay. Hopefully you can see my screen here. Does it show?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So many of you hopefully saw the initial map that we created a few weeks back that just kind of painted a picture of the general landscape of eligibility for low-income communities and contiguous tracts. We didn't really allow people to click on individual tracts and get more information about it because we weren't confident at that point in some of the way that we were calculating the contiguous definitions. So what I'll be showing today is a new tool that we put together that not only gives more detailed information about the eligibility for any given tract, but also allows us to look at how these opportunity zone eligible tracts intersect with other existing federal programs and with our Opportunity 360 outcome indices. So I'm going to be showing this from my desktop today, but we will be making this tool available online this week. So you will all receive a link to access this, along with a link to download the underlying data so that you can add in additional local data sets and extend what we've started here in your work yourself. So when I open this tool, I see a state-level map instead of the national map, the national level map that we had initially created. And given that the designations are occurring state by state, we thought this would be a better starting point for folks to think about eligibility. So I can use the Select State drop-down here to pick another state, and you can see that the map will zoom to that state, and we'll be looking at tracts in that state. You'll also see here at the top right some numbers relating to the maximum, the total number of low-income communities in the state, and then the maximum number of tracts that could be designated as a result. So that's that maximum number divided by 4, rounded down, as I said before. And then here you see a breakdown of the tracts that meet the filter criteria that I'll talk about in a minute, broken down by the type of eligibility. So this gives you a kind of benchmark for how close or far away you are from the designation maximum as you're applying different filters. And you can find those filters down here. So at the top we have a group of filters that cover some broader characteristics that we can filter on. So we can zoom into a particular county within the state if we want to. We can filter based on whether we want to look at just urban or rural tracts. So if we click this, you'll see the tracts that are urban disappear. And so now we're just looking at rural tracts, and you can see the numbers here adjust based on the filters that I'm applying. So here's just urban tracts. And then below this is a group of filters we have for federal place-based programs. So I can look, for example, at Opportunity Zone eligible tracts that have received some kind of new market tax credit investment in the past, if I like. or promise zone designations, and these all are might be hard to see on the map if I start applying these. So let's say if we look only at promise zones, so I might want to zoom in to different parts of the map so that I could kind of get more information about particular tracts that meet those criteria. But you can see when I hover over the tracts, I'm getting more information about the poverty rate and the benchmarked percent of median family income that tract has relative to the metropolitan or the statewide median family income. So there's that. And then finally down at the bottom, we have our Opportunity 360 outcomes framework, and we can filter the tracts based on their scores across our 5 outcome dimensions. So for example, maybe in my city I want to specifically look for tracts with stronger measures of housing stability because I'm worried that this program could lead to displacement among vulnerable populations. So I might crank up this filter to not only look at tracts, or to only look at tracts with better housing stability. If I want to see a list of the specific tracts that meet the filter criteria, I can flip over to the Info tab here and get a list of the census tracts broken down by whether they are actually low-income communities or eligible tracts. And I can also see some additional information about the eligibility criteria and at the bottom the Opportunity 360 scores that we have at the bottom. We'll be adding some additional documentation before we post this online for how we determine the urban and rural distinctions, where we got our data for the federal program overlays, and so forth to make this all as transparent as possible. So I will leave it there for today. That's kind of a quick overview of our Opportunity Zone eligibility tool created by the Opportunity 360 team at Enterprise. We'll be sending around a link, as I said, later this week to access this tool and download the data behind it. We hope this will at least provide a solid starting point for those of you who are thinking about eligibility for this program, and especially given the short time window, we know that any help in providing that starting point is appreciated. So with that said, I will turn the microphone back over to Rachel to close us out.
Yeah, thanks so much, Zach, and thanks for everyone for sticking with us. I know we're running over a little bit on time. So basically, here's some additional resources that we have. A link, which I think is really important, to that Missouri Department of Economic Development. They actually created a landing page for Opportunity Zones program, as well as that RFP. You can take a look at it. I do think it's important to have that level of engagement, so wanted to share that with everyone, as well as a new resource center that Novogradac has created, that webinar that Olivia referenced earlier from the National Development Council, a 1 minute and 30-second video from Senator Tim Scott, staff directory and contact information for the National Governors Association, contact your governor, as well as some additional resources that Enterprise is going to continue to be pushing out, as well as economic innovation groups. So with that being said, I do want to just thank everyone at Enterprise. This has been a real team effort over the past 6 weeks. We're going to continue to share information. Our goal is that we're putting the right resources and tools in folks' hands to be really thoughtful about how the program is implemented, about how opportunity zones are designated, moving information about what type of capital is going to be provided through these funds, what it will and will not do. We really think that the opportunity zone should be aligned with other mutually reinforcing state resources and federal programs, just, promise zones, empowerment zones, renewal communities, as well as other local economic development initiatives that are going to really maximize and optimize the benefits that can come from this new source of capital, which, is a new source of capital. It's going to really, I think, plug a gap that's been missing as far as driving equity investment into communities. But in that same vein, I think that we need to be really intentional around policies and strategies to proactively guard and protect against displacement in these communities and ensure that the benefits that we're going to see from all of that are realized across the board, and really make sure that equitable investment is a cornerstone of this program, and that the legacy of the program really is about that. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Donna to close us out.
And all I really have to say is a big thank you. With that, it's time to conclude today's session. And thank you to our panelists and to everyone joining us today. We hope to see you online again soon. Goodbye.